On the day following that upon which we returned to Tarifa, I was sent to Gibraltar with dispatches giving an account of our late movements to the Lieutenant Governor, who was much pleased with the conduct of the regiment in general, but particularly with that of Colonel Brown for the determined and judicious manner in which he conducted the whole of the operations, as was fully testified by General Beguines in a dispatch written to General Campbell on the subject. Rather excited than depressed by the failure of the intended sortie from Cadiz, General Graham, the resources of whose mind multiplied in proportion as difficulties appeared, still insisted not only on the local advantages to be gained by a sortie before Soult should return with reinforcements, but also that to boldly march out from the strongest hold in Spain and undauntedly maintain the war in the open field would inspire the nation with confidence and stimulate the whole population to the deeds of national glory which Spaniards were wont to perform. He contended that with such sentiments properly directed, the Spaniards alone were an overmatch for any invading nation, and would shortly succeed in freeing their country and driving every Frenchman in Spain down the northern side of the Pyrenees. These arguments could not be opposed even by General La Peña, who opposed everything except the enemy. It was therefore arranged that 7,000 Spaniards and 3,000 British troops should embark at Cadiz and sailing to Tarifa, there descend, since that was the nearest place which the Allies possessed, in rear of the enemy's lines. To facilitate this enterprise, General Graham made a sacrifice not easily paralleled. He ceded the chief command to his ally, thus patriotically giving up the certainty of personal fame as a leader for the honour of his country's arms and the prosperity of the general cause. And such was the confidence he felt in the valour of the British troops under his command and in the happy results, if La Peña would only do his duty towards his country or do anything except what was glaringly wrong, that he condescended to serve under the Spanish general, and that, too, against the opinion of Lord Wellington, who recommended him never to move out of Cadiz to execute any movement except in chief command. The Duke well knew by dearly bought experience of what leaven Spanish generals were moulded. He knew that it required the utmost exertions of a British general to persuade those of Spain to save their own corps, without calculating on more. Of this, Cuesta gave convincing proof by his movements before the Battle of Talavera, by his inertness and incapacity while the battle raged, and above all by his disgraceful conduct after the battle was fought, on account of which his lordship felt compelled for the safety of his own troops to separate from the Spanish army, bidding them farewell with feelings of respect for the gallant soldiers, of contempt for the vanity and ignorance of their commanders, and of distrust of the government who would have devoted their allies and compromised the honour and independence of their country for personal ambition and mean self-interested motives. Spanish character in the different branches was discovered rather too late for his advantage by Sir John Moore, who portrayed it in its true colours for the information of His Majesty's councillors and the guidance of his successors in Spain. It was now agreed that Generals La Peña and Graham should march immediately after disembarkation against the rear of the enemy's lines, force a passage to the continental bank of the Santipetri River, and by dislodging the French from the posts which they there occupied, cover the construction of the bridge and the sortie from the Isla de Leon. The Spanish general, Zayas, who was appointed to the command at Cadiz during La Peña's absence, was directed to second the project if the opportune moment should arrive. All being now ready, General Graham with the British troops sailed from Cadiz on February 21st for Tarifa. This place presenting only a roadstead and the wind blowing fresh on the 22nd, when the general came before it, a descent was found impracticable, and he therefore proceeded to Algeciras, where he landed, and marching over an excessively bad road, arrived on the evening of the 23rd at Tarifa. The weather continuing boisterous, the troops halted to await the Spaniards, and Major Duncan's brigade of guns, which had been disembarked at Algeciras, had to be put on board again and brought by water to Tarifa on account of the state of the road over which a wheelbarrow could not be rolled without disaster. At Tarifa, the 28th Regiment were garrisoned under the command of Colonel Belson, who had rejoined a few days previously from England. General Graham, being well acquainted with the old corps, particularly during the campaign of Sir John Moore, requested General Campbell's leave to lead it during the expedition, which was granted. But the Lieutenant Governor, not forgetting Colonel Brown's eminent services during his long command at Tarifa, under many critical circumstances, sent the flank companies of the 9th and 82nd Regiments from Gibraltar, which, together with those of the 28th Regiment, were to be placed under the command of Colonel Brown, thus giving him an independent flank battalion, subject to no orders but those coming direct from General Graham. During the few days which the British troops spent at Tarifa, our time was passed in that jovial conviviality always to be observed among British soldiers on the opening of a campaign. This formed a remarkable era in the history of the 28th Regiment, never equalled in any other corps. They formed the proper garrison of Tarifa, and having been quartered there for some time, were the only regiment which had an established mess. The town furnished but one posada, or inn, if it may be so called, and this afforded but little accommodation to so large a concourse as that now assembled. Upwards of 150 officers dined at our mess daily. Those of the regiment, together with those of the flank companies sent from Gibraltar, who were of course honorary members, amounted to nearly 50, for the officers of the 28th Regiment, never being much addicted to depot duty, always mustered strong at headquarters. Our mess room was very spacious, and at either end was a room which entered into it. Not only these three, but in fact every room in the house had tables put down, and many there were who felt glad to procure a dinner even in the kitchen. The draught on our cellar was deep, and profiting by the experience of the first day of the Jubilee, on the second day, the 24th, we passed a restriction act limiting each officer to a pint of port and half a bottle of claret. But notwithstanding this precaution, we ran a pipe of port dry in less than 4 days. Porter and brandy, being easily procured, were not subject to restriction. A great part of these was disposed of in the kitchen and the small rooms by the messman as his private speculation. It was calculated that, including port claret brandy and porter, 2,000 bottles were emptied in our mess house within the week. Our wine accounts, as must be evident under such circumstances, were much confused and difficult to keep, since it was no easy matter to ascertain with whom each visitor had dined. The mess waiter was sent round daily to ascertain this fact, so necessary for the guidance of the wine committee. Discrepancies not unfrequently occurred between the highly favoured host and the too obliging guest. I recollect the mess waiter telling Colonel Belson one day that Lieutenant Colonel Arthur said he dined with him, upon which Belson remarked to the guest, loud enough to be heard by many, "Arthur, you do not dine with me." The other very humorously replied, "Oh, I beg pardon, I made a mistake. Now I recollect, it was for tomorrow I was engaged to you." "There you are mistaken again," said Belson. "It was for yesterday, when you did not forget." These circumstances I recollect well, as I happened to be president of the mess for that week. Colonel Belson would not allow me to cede the chair, and always sat on my left hand. Our messman, a sergeant of the regiment named Farrell, although he piqued himself on an acquaintance with algebra, yet with all the aid of the assumed numbers, ABC, could never discover the unknown quantities consumed. He went into the field at Barosa, but was never heard of afterwards. Among the slain he was not, and, inquiries being made at the French headquarters, he was not one of the few prisoners taken with a part of our baggage, which fell into the hands of the enemy previous to the commencement of the action, when the Spaniards in their way lived to fight another day. It is more than probable that in the annals of warfare no regiment has ever had an opportunity of enjoying themselves to such an extent as the 28th Regiment, while General Graham's army remained at Tarifa. We were happy to see our friends, who, to do them justice, waiving all ceremony, showed us extraordinary attention. Even the sergeants contrived to procure a room, where they enjoyed themselves as much as the officers in the mess room, and their jokes, if not equally refined, were not the less entertaining. Being a member of the mess committee, my avocations obliged me to keep a vigilant lookout through all parts of the house, which gave me an opportunity of hearing unobserved many of the jests and repartees which took place in the sergeant's room, or debating society, as it was termed. But although these were at times rather sharp, still perfect good humour prevailed throughout. The principal spokesmen, if my memory fail not, were a Sergeant Turnbull of the Guards and a Sergeant O'Brien of the 87th Regiment. They were most determined opponents, and each had a bigoted attachment to his own country, in support of which he poured forth witty and pungent repartees to the great entertainment of the auditors. On one occasion, while I was on my way to our cellar, which was fast falling into consumption, my steps were arrested by loud bursts of laughter issuing from the debating room. The first words which I distinctly heard were, "Oh, oh, oh, you are all O's in Ireland." This remark evidently came from the guardsman, when O'Brien dryly replied, "O means from, or the descendant of. Therefore I am not surprised at its being ridiculed by persons of your country, where long line of descent is so difficult to be traced." "And pray, Mr. O, from whom are you descended?" "From Brian Boro, the great Boro." "And surely Boro must be a corruption of the Spanish word burro, which signifies an ass." Then Pat grew eloquent on the deeds of his great ancestor, who at the age of 80 gained a most glorious victory over the invading Danes on the celebrated plains of Clontarf. Equally eloquent was he also on the demerits of the Englishmen of that ancient time, until cried out the British sergeant with a fine scorn, "I like to hear a fellow of your kind, with your beggarly Irish pride, talking of records and historical facts. Look to the history of your own country to learn its disgrace. What have you ever done or achieved except through murders, robbery, cruelty, bloodshed, and treachery? Have you not always been fighting amongst yourselves or against your masters, since we did you the honour of conquering you?" "If we compare notes about murder and treachery, you need not fear being left in the background," retorted the Irishman. "And as to the honour of being conquered, faith, I cannot cope with you in your dignities there, for I cannot deny that you have been honoured in that way by Romans and by Danes and by Saxons and by Picts and by Scots." "Your arguments," at last said the Englishman, after some further exchange of historical fragments, "might pass without contempt had they not been delivered with such a disgusting brogue. I should recommend you to go back again to some charity school, I mean, in England." "If I intended to go to a charity school, it should certainly be in England. In my country, it is only the destitute who go, but in yours it is the rich men who send their sons on to the foundations of the public schools, which were originally intended for the education of poor clergymen's sons. With respect to my brogue, which you civilly term disgusting, it is our national accent, and not disgusting to native ears, although to us the language is foreign. But I should like to know with what accent your countrymen spoke bastard French when it was crammed down their throats with a rod of iron for upwards of 300 years. "A language does not go down the throat," said the Englishman. "It comes up, at least in every other country except Ireland. I make you a present of the bull, although there is no necessity for the donation, for all bulls are Irish." "How are all bulls Irish?" "Because England, your mother country, has ceded all bulls to you as being legitimately Irish." "I don't understand how you make out England to be our mother country. Stepmother is the proper term to give her, and faith, a true stepmother she has proved herself to be. Thus raged the fight amid the laughter and encouragement of the hearers, until, being president of the mess, I was reluctantly obliged to return to the mess room. During the stay of the British Army at Tarifa, strong working parties were constantly employed in levelling the roads, which the French engineers had frequently reported impassable for artillery. However, profiting by our exertions in the present instance, they subsequently brought guns against Tarifa. The stormy weather having somewhat abated, the 2nd Division of the fleet, laden with La Peña and 7,000 Spaniards, arrived off Tarifa on the morning of the 27th. It still blew fresh, but owing to the indefatigable exertions of the navy, the astonished Spaniards found themselves all disembarked before the evening. Again they were startled at the activity of the British general, who would have marched that night. The forward state in which the British were induced the Spaniards to proclaim their army also in movable condition. La Peña and his troops thus prepared and the roads made passable for artillery, the march was announced for the morrow. The night of the 27th being the last jovial one, the army were to pass at Tarifa. 191 officers dined at the mess. The exhilarating juice of the grape was freely quaffed from out the crystal cup, and the inspiring songs of love and war went joyfully round, and the conclusion of each animating strophe was loudly hailed with choral cheers. For such is the composition of a soldier that the object of his love and his country's foe alike call forth the strongest and most indomitable effusions of his heart. So closely allied is love to battle. Hilarity and mirth reigned throughout. Lively sallies of wit, cheerfully received as guilelessly shot forth, added brilliancy to the festive board. Officers having entered their profession young, mutual attachment was firmly cemented, genuine and disinterested. Each man felt sure that he sat between two friends. Worldly considerations, beyond legitimate pleasures and professional ambition, were banished from our thoughts. The field of glory was present to our view, and equally open to all. None meanly envied the proud distinctions which chance of war fortunately threw in the way of others. Oh, what an odious change I have lived to witness! But the days of our youth are the days of our friendship, our love, and our glory. A fig for the friendship commenced after the age of 16 or 17, when the cool, calculating and sordid speculations of man suffocate the fervid and generous feelings of youth. Our revels continued until the morning, and in the morning, while many a Spanish fair with waving hands and glistening eyes was seen in the balcony, we marched out of Tarifa with aching heads but glowing hearts. Towards evening we halted, and the army was modelled. The leading division was placed under the command of General Lardizabal, an officer in every way qualified for the post. The Prince of Anglona was appointed to the centre or principal body of the Spaniards, but with this body La Peña remained. 2 regiments of Spanish Guards, the Walloons and that of the Royal City, were attached to the British troops commanded by General Graham. This corps were termed the Reserve. The artillery were attached fortunately to the troops of their respective nations, but by some courteous mismanagement, 2 squadrons of German hussars were united to the Spanish cavalry under the command of Colonel Whittingham, and thus attached to the Spanish army. This officer held higher rank in the Spanish army, and, if I recollect right, commanded a corps of Spanish cavalry clad and paid by England. But their movements were peculiarly Spanish. On March 1st, La Peña moved towards Casavieja and marched the whole army in column of companies nearly within gunshot of that post. And while moving along the plain close to the blessed old house, the column was reduced to subdivisions, giving the enemy full opportunity of counting every man in the army. Whether this extraordinary mode of procedure arose from treachery or ignorance cannot be asserted, for at that time it was difficult to distinguish one from the other in the movements of Spanish generals. However that may be, The circumstance was loudly censured by all. As soon as the army halted, General Graham mentioned this oversight to Lepena. Yet it was not until next morning, and after the whole Allied army had passed the post mentioned on its route to Medina Sidonia, that the British general obtained permission to dislodge the enemy from the convent. The light company of the 28th Regiment, having made close acquaintance with the post not long previously, were sent on this duty. On our approach, the enemy evacuated the convent. As we were not able to come up with them, a party of the German hussars were sent in pursuit, by whom they were soon overtaken. But although thus threatened by cavalry, they considered it unadvisable to form square, as the light company were fast approaching. They therefore turned round and formed line. Here some untoward work took place on both sides. The French, seeing no possibility of escape, remained steady until the Germans were close upon them, when they deliberately fired a volley at them and then threw down their arms. 2 of the cavalry were killed and others wounded. The Germans, enraged at their loss and justly considering it an act of wanton and useless bloodshed, charged the unfortunate defenceless wretches, sparing not a man. All were cut down. I never in my life witnessed in so small an affair such mutilation of human beings. When they were carried into the convent yard, the doctor of the 82nd Regiment, attached to the flank battalion, declined to dress their wounds, as it was totally impossible that any one of them could survive. The light company were left en piquet or rear guard in the convent during the day, with orders to join the army after dusk at Medina Sidonia. Not long after this, we were all astonished at seeing the whole army retiring, but could descry no enemy to account for the movement. However, it appeared that as Lepena moved on Medina, he was informed by some roving Spanish soldiers whom he met that Medina had lately been reinforced. Upon this information alone, he made the retrograde movement, which cost the Spaniards many lives, and might have been fatal to the Spanish cause, but of this in its place. Thenceforth, Lepena was distrusted by every British soldier, and the constancy of General Graham in accompanying him farther is to be much admired. At nightfall the piquet joined its own battalion, not at Medina, but on the very ground whence the army moved that morning. On the morning of the 3rd, taking nearly an opposite direction to that of Medina, the army moved towards Veja. This day's march was excessively harassing. A causeway, along which we must pass, was constructed over the edge of a lake, and the heavy rains had so swollen the waters that not a vestige of the causeway was perceptible. Our guides were guerrillas, but imperfectly acquainted with the place, and thus many of our men, in attempting the passage, fell into the deep. Even along the causeway, when discovered, we were up to our middle in water. The track was marked by placing men on the submerged road. The British general with his staff stood in the water to guide and animate the soldiers during their aquatic movement. Having passed this obstacle, which occupied much time, we pushed on to Veja, from which we dislodged the enemy there posted. The town is built on a high conical hill, looking down on the celebrated Bay of Trafalgar, where every breast was filled with thoughts of the immortal Nelson. From this eminence, the enemy had a full view of the surrounding country, and not only could discover all our movements as we approached, but, as on the preceding day, when we were passing the convent, were enabled to ascertain our exact strength. On the afternoon of the 4th, about 3 o'clock, the army again moved forward before the men's clothing and appointments were dry. General Graham, previous to leaving Tarifa, requested Lepena to make short marches and thus bring the troops fresh into action. But the Spanish general, as is common with the weak, imagining that genius was marked by diversity of opinion and mistaking mulish obstinacy for unshaken determination, disregarded this sound advice. He acted on the principle of differing from the British general in everything, and accordingly he marched the army for 16 hours, the greater part of the time during a cold night, making frequent momentary halts, which always tend to harass rather than refresh troops. On the dawn of the 5th, our advanced guard of cavalry, Spanish, were encountered and worsted by a few French dragoons. The affair was trifling, yet its moral influence was sensibly felt throughout the day. Cold, wearied, dejected but not disheartened, we still moved forward, until the sun, rising with unusual splendor and genial warmth, dissipated the drowsiness, which but a moment previously bowed down every head and roused us to wonted animation. On opening our eyes to broad daylight, we found ourselves on the southwest skirts of Chiclana Plain. Letter of La Peña. On the evening of February 27th, La Peña had written from Tarifa to General Zayas, communicating his intention to move forward next day, and stating that Medina Sidonia would be in his possession on the 2nd of the ensuing month, and that he would be close to the Isla de Leon on the evening of the 3rd. Zayas, acting on mail coach time, regardless of unforeseen contingencies, badness of roads, or any other obstacles which might retard La Peña's advance, and without ascertaining whether that general was close at hand or not, trusting only to his watch for regulating his measures, laid down the bridge on the night of the 3rd. The following day passed without any appearance of La Peña or the British troops. The enemy, taking advantage of this delay, attacked the bridge on the night of the 4th with their piquets and small detachments, killed and wounded many Spaniards, took 300 prisoners, and broke 2 links of the bridge. It was through mere good fortune that the Isla did not fall into their hands. At the critical moment, Captain A. Hunt, R.A., with the 10-inch howitzers, arrived and supported a charge made by a Spanish regiment over the bridge of boats, and so the enemy were repulsed. But if Marshal Victor had been more active and had marched down 6,000 or 8,000 men during the 4th and screened them behind Bermeja Castle until night, and then made his attack with such a force, instead of with some 600 or 700, there is not the slightest doubt but that he would have taken the Isla and then either defended or destroyed the bridge. Under such circumstances, the Allied army would have been compelled to retire to Gibraltar to avoid Sebastiani, who, upon learning that Victor was in possession of the Isla, would of course have come forward with an overwhelming force. It was in consequence of the losses sustained at the bridge on the night of the 4th and morning of the 5th, together with the imminent danger in which the Isla de Leon was of being taken, that I venture to say that La Peña's dastardly retreat from Medina Sidonia cost the Spaniards many lives and might have been fatal to the Spanish cause. La Peña's proceedings on our arrival at the plain of Chiclana were equally absurd and dangerous. Early on that morning, the 5th, he ordered General Lardizabal down to the Santi Petri point without giving or receiving any information whatever. Not even a gun was fired to give notice to those in the Isla of our arrival, nor was it ascertained whether the bridge was strongly defended or in whose possession it actually was. The proceedings of Zayas and La Peña offer a correct specimen of the manner in which combined movements were executed by Spanish generals. All acted independently and generally in direct opposition to each other. On this occasion, Lardizabal acted gallantly. Having beaten away a strong force of the enemy from the Santi Petri point, he established communication with Zayas, thus enabling him with 3,000 Spanish troops and an immense park of artillery to pass from the Isla over the bridge. The army, as already mentioned, entered the plain of Chiclana early on the morning of the 5th, close to a low mountain ridge called Cerro de Puerco, or the Boar's Neck, from its curving shape bristling with pine trees, and from the number of those animals always to be found there. This ridge, distant from the point of Santi Petri about 4 miles, gradually descends for nearly 1.5 miles to the Chiclana plain. On its north side, the plain is broken by ravines, pits, and rugged ground. A large pine forest hems it on all sides at unequal distances. Situated midway between the hill and Santi Petri point, close to the western point of Cerro de Puerco, stands La Torre, or the Tower of Barosa. The eastern point of this ridge looks upon the space between Chiclana and the Santi Petri, whilst its western boundary looks down upon the boat road leading from Veia to Bermeja and the Isla de Leon, passing within less than half a mile of the tower above mentioned. In preparing for the battle, General Graham, like an experienced soldier, pointed out to La Peña all the advantages which the ground offered, insisting on the absolute necessity of occupying the ridge of Barosa with their strongest force, it being the key of the whole ground. But the Spanish general, indignant at having his proper line pointed out by a foreigner, spurned his advice and being borne out by his adjutant General Lacy, ordered the British general to proceed to Bermeja to maintain the communication between the Allied troops in the field and those in the Isla. General Graham, although naturally courteous and through policy yielding, yet on this occasion absolutely refused obedience until the Spaniard pledged himself to post on the heights of Barosa a Spanish force at least equal to that commanded by the British general. Long before his movement down to Bermeja, he detached Colonel Brown with his battalion to occupy the western point of Barosa. There we were shortly afterwards joined by the Walloon and the Ciudad Real regiments of guards. To this body were subsequently added 3 other Spanish battalions, 4 guns, and all the Allied cavalry, commanded, as I have already said, by Colonel Whittingham. The whole were under the orders of General Kruse-Mergen, accompanied by Brigadier General Beguines, and all, as we thought, determined to do their duty. Soon after General Graham with the British division had moved from the plain through the pine grove towards Bermeja, Marshal Victor, who anxiously watched the movements of the Allies, seeing their troops at 3 different points, Barosa, Santi Petri and Bermeja, moved forward from Chiclana towards the road which leads from Veja. This movement was not immediately perceived by us, the Spaniards being placed between our battalion and the point mentioned. But a confused and hasty movement on their part induced the colonel to send me to ascertain the cause. I was told by General Kruse-Mergen that they merely wished to take ground to our left. But seeing the hurry of the Spaniards increase, I instantly galloped beyond their extreme flank, and now discovered the French cavalry moving towards the coast road, and rather inclining towards our position. Retiring quickly, I reported the circumstance to Colonel Brown. By this time, the greater part of the Spanish troops had passed between us and the coast road and were soon in rapid march towards the beach leading to Bermeja. Colonel Brown strongly and rather indignantly remonstrated against their conduct. At this period, Colonel Whittingham rode up, and addressing Colonel Brown said, "Colonel Brown, what do you intend to do?" The reply was, "What do I intend to do, sir? I intend to fight the French." Whittingham then remarked, "You may do as you please, Colonel Brown, but we are decided on a retreat." "Very well, sir," replied Brown. "I shall stop where I am, for it shall never be said that John Frederick Brown ran away from the post which his general ordered him to defend." Generals Mergen and Beguines were present during the conversation, and as they expressed a wish to know its exact import, I informed them word for word in plain Spanish, which I pledge myself was a correct and full interpretation, and could not be misunderstood. Colonel Whittingham again addressed Colonel Brown, saying, "If you will not come with us, but wish to retire on General Graham's division, I shall give you a squadron of cavalry to cover your retreat." Brown wheeled round, making no answer, and thus a formidable corps, composed of 2 regiments of Royal Spanish Guards, 3 regiments of the line, a park of artillery, and a strong force of cavalry, all well armed, clad, and appointed, undaunted by the scowling frowns of their allies and the reproachful taunts of their own countrymen, were not afraid to run away. They retrograded with firm tread, nor faltering step nor slow was seen, and not one longing, lingering look was cast behind. They left 470 British bayonets bristling on the neck of the boar. The Spaniards being now out of the way and soon out of sight, Colonel Brown directed Lieutenant Sparks, 30th Regiment, who acted as engineer to loophole a chapel which stood on the summit of the hill. Some men were loosely thrown in, and the remainder of our little battalion formed three sides of an oblong square, the low tower or chapel supplying the fourth face. By this time, the French cavalry had gained the coast road, probably either to cut off the retreat of the Allies by that route or to prevent any troops coming by way of Végère. Be that as it may, they now turned directly towards us. On approaching nearly within musket range, they opened right and left, apparently to gain both our flanks, and now for the first time their artillery were discovered not far behind, and at the same moment their infantry were seen moving forward, darkening the distant part of the plain which skirts the town of Chiclana. Hesitation would now be madness. Our men were instantly withdrawn from the chapel, and forming column of quarter distance, we proceeded quickly down the hill towards the pine forest, which shut out Bermeja from our view. The enemy's horsemen were soon on every side of our little column and kept gradually closing in. But dreading that, before we could get away to a sufficient distance from the hill, the artillery, which we had seen whipping over the plain, would open their fire upon us, we durst not halt to form square. Our situation was rather perplexing, but we were determined. In this order we moved rapidly down the hill, which being uneven and woody, favoured our retreat. But on crossing a ravine we became more exposed, having entered on comparatively level ground scarce of wood. Colonel Brown now threw out a few loose files, but not far from each angle of the column, to warn the cavalry off, some few of whom were hurt by their fire. To say the truth, the cavalry showed rather a wavering inclination than a firm determination to charge us. Having passed over the level ground, we touched the skirts of the forest, and on our forming line the cavalry drew off. During these operations, General Graham, entangled in the pine forest, was pressing forward towards Bermeja, when two peasants rode breathless up to him, stating that the whole French army, headed by Marshal Victor, were rapidly crossing the plain of Chiclana and coming down on his rear. Upon this, he immediately turned round and soon perceived the Spaniards, who had fled from the hill, posting along towards the coast. And since these were mistaken for French, the English troops were on the point of firing into them. At this moment, Captain Calvert, having discovered something red through the thick foliage of the wood, cried out, "That must be Colonel Brown's flank battalion!" and darting forward, soon discovered his surmise to be fact. General Graham came forth instantly to meet us, saying, "Brown, did I not give you orders to defend Barosa Hill?" "Yes, sir," said Brown, "but you would not have me fight the whole French army with 470 men." "Had you not," replied the general, "5 Spanish battalions together with artillery and cavalry?" "Oh," said Brown, "they all ran away long before the enemy came within cannon shot." The general coolly replied, "It is a bad business, Brown. You must instantly turn round and attack." "Very well," said the colonel. "Am I to attack in extended order as flankers, or as a close battalion?" "In open order," was the reply, and the general returned to the troops in the wood. All this time we never saw our English comrades, though they were close before us, so dense was the wood. The flank battalion were instantly extended into skirmishing order, which had scarcely been done when the general again rode back to Colonel Brown, saying, "I must show something more serious than skirmishing. Close the men into compact battalion." "That I will with pleasure," cried the colonel, "for it is more in my way than light bobbing." The order to close on the centre was instantly bugled out, during which movement the colonel sent to know from the general, who had again retired, if he was to advance as soon as formed, and whether he was to attack immediately in his front or more towards his right. The answer was, "Attack in your front, and immediately." All being now ready, Colonel Brown rode to the front of the battalion, and taking off his hat, said in a voice to be heard by all, "Gentlemen, I am happy to be the bearer of good news. General Graham has done you the honour of being the first to attack those fellows. Now follow me, you rascals." He pointed to the enemy and, giving the order to advance, broke into his favourite air. "Now cheer up, my brave lads. To glory we steer, to add something new to this wonderful year." Thus we moved forward with 468 men and 21 officers to attack the position, upon which but 3/4 of an hour previously we had stood in proud defiance of the advancing foe, but which was now defended by 2,500 infantry and 8 pieces of artillery, together with some cavalry. To this force were added 2 battalions of chosen grenadiers, commanded by General Rousseau, the whole under the orders of the General of Division, Ruffin. The result of the conflict between such a force and our lone little battalion, whose strength I have already mentioned, must be anticipated. The enemy, seeing so small a force detached from any apparent support advancing against them, allowed us to approach close, and the orders given by Colonel Brown were that not a shot should be fired, but to proceed to work as soon as possible with the bayonet. As soon as we crossed the ravine close to the base of the hill and formed on the opposite side, a most tremendous roar of cannon and musketry was all at once opened, Ruffin's whole division pointing at us with muskets, and 8 pieces of ordnance sending forth their grape, firing as one salvo. Nearly 200 of our men and more than half the officers went down by this first volley, thus opening the battle propitiously for them. We now literally stood in extended order. The battalion was checked. In closing on the centre and endeavouring to form a second efficient line, upwards of 50 more men and some officers were levelled with the earth, and all the exertions of Colonel Brown could not form a third line. We had by this time lost upwards of 250 men and 14 officers, between killed and wounded, the remainder of the battalion now scattered. The men commenced firing from behind trees, mounds, or any cover which presented, and could not be got together. When I say that out of 21 officers, the whole number who originally went into action, 14 were put hors de combat, this latter number might be given as 19, for 2 officers only of the battalion were now to be seen standing on the field, Colonel Brown and the humble author of these memoirs, wounded. The colonel now addressed me, saying, "I shall go and join the guards. Will you come?" I declined the proposition, remarking that not being just then firm on my legs, it would take me some time to arrive at where the guards were, that he was unhurt and mounted and could confidently go. His character for bravery had been established throughout the army for many years, but as for me, although I had seen a good deal of service, particularly during the campaign of Sir John Moore, still I was a very young man, and I therefore told him that so long as 3 men of the battalion stood together and I was able to stand with them, I should not separate from them. The colonel galloped off and joined the guards, who were at that moment passing at some distance in rear of where our right flank originally stood, now marked only by our dead. The guards moved forwards with astonishing celerity and steadiness, although not formed and exposed at the time to a tremendous fire of grape and musketry. To this new scene of slaughter it was that Colonel Brown directed his course. When the flank battalion were first ordered to advance, we were not in sight of the other British troops, but as we approached the ravine, casting a glance behind, we discovered the guards emerging from the forest. They presented neither line nor column, a confused mass showing no order whatever, one order alone excepted, and that they gallantly maintained throughout the day. It was the order to advance against the foe. Every round shot which struck their mass passed over our heads, we then being close under the hill upon which the enemy were posted. The first advance of General Dykes's brigade was directly in our rear. This direction was continued until the wood, which stretched forward immediately on his right flank, was cleared. His brigade then brought up their left shoulders until our right flank was passed. Dykes now brought forward his right, and extending his line gallantly pressed on to attack the left of Ruffin's division, made heavy by General Rousseau's grenadiers. Soon after Colonel Brown's departure, Captain, long since Lieutenant Colonel, Calvert, General Graham's aide-de-camp, rode up to where I was carrying on a kind of fight with a very few men about me. Perceiving the destruction around, and seeing some soldiers straggling and firing some way in the rear, he requested me to go back and bring them up. This I positively refused, stating that I was wounded in the thigh, and were I to proceed to the rear, I could never regain my place with an army advancing. I added that, as he was mounted, he would be safe in making the attempt. Calvert smiled and rode off, but not to the rear. Again I was left comparatively alone. By this time the near approach of the Guards claimed a large portion of the enemy's fire, which previously had been directed to the place where the remains of the flank battalion still continued to fire from behind defences. I now contrived to get 8 or 10 of the men together, principally 9th Grenadiers and 28th Light Infantry. To this little force I proposed charging a howitzer, which was pouring forth destruction immediately in our front. The proposition being well received, I seized a firelock, there were many spare ones, and on this a drummer named Adams of the 28th Grenadiers Company said that were he not afraid of being obliged to pay for his drum, he also would take a musket. Upon my telling the boy that I would pay for his drum, he flung it away and armed. I have always thought Adams the bravest man, or rather boy, whom I ever met. Not for seizing a musket and gallantly charging, for in excitement that was natural enough, but that he should stand calmly calculating the price of a drum when hundreds of balls were passing close to his body is scarcely credible. But so it was. We now darted forward, and were so fortunate as to capture the gun at the very moment when it was being reloaded. 2 artillerymen were bayoneted, the others rode off on their mules. This was not a gun fallen into our hands. It was taken at the point of the bayonet, and however I may be criticised for saying it, I was the first person who placed a hand on the howitzer, and afterwards, with some chalky earth, I marked it 28th Regiment. Scarcely had the gun been taken when we were joined, as if through magic effect, by upwards of 100 men of the flank battalion, a proof that they were not far distant. They darted forth from behind trees, briars, brakes, and out of hollows. I could imagine myself standing on Ben Leddy's side. We now confidently advanced up the hill, and unlike most advances against a heavy fire, our numbers increased as we proceeded, soldiers of the flank battalion joining at every step. On capturing the gun, I threw down the firelock and bayonet which I carried, but Adams retained his and putting on a pouch did good service during the remainder of the day. Soon after the movement of General Dykes in rear of the flank battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Barnard, also commanding a flank battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel Bath, leading the 2 flank companies of the 20th Portuguese Regiment, pushed forward to the left, and were immediately in fight with the enemy's tirailleurs. Colonel Wheatley, who commanded those troops together with the 28th, 67th and 87th Regiments, disentangling himself from the pine forest, and at the same time prolonging his left flank, soon found himself opposed to the division of General Laval, who, debouching from the Chiclana wood, advanced so far as to form an obtuse angle with Ruffin's division, already in line and engaged on the hill. Laval bore heavily forward in dense column, sending forth a continued peal of musketry, reckless of the destructive fire of our artillery, which took him in front and flank. Previous to these movements of Dykes and of Wheatley, Major Duncan was sent forward with his brigade of artillery, consisting of 10 guns. He came up rather close in rear of Brown's flank battalion, soon after we were engaged, and next to our own battalion, the artillery were the first British troops in action. The guns were soon embattled in rear of our left flank. Their murderous fire was quick and heavily pitched into Laval's advancing columns. Yet Laval still pressed forward until Wheatley's brigade advancing, firing and deploying, came in contact with them, Then the 87th Regiment, commanded by Major Gough, making a desperate charge, completely overthrew the 8th French Regiment, capturing their eagle. In the meantime, Laval, moving forward his right wing, whom he strengthened with a battalion of grenadiers, attempted to turn Wheatley's left flank, but Colonel Belson, with the 28th Regiment, who formed the left of Wheatley's brigade, coming up, forming and firing by companies, kept back his left wing in a diagonal direction, and by making a vigorous charge of the whole regiment served Laval in the manner in which the French general would have served him. He completely turned his flank. At this period, the strife was fierce, but the British cheer passing through the entire brigade, the whole line now pushed forward. A general charge took place, and Laval's division were upset. Wheatley's brigade, now bringing forward at their left, and whilst in full pursuit, fell in with the enemy's corps of reserve, who were instantly put to flight at the point of the bayonet. In the meantime, the Guards, led on by General Dykes, pushed gallantly forward with lengthened step and lofty bearing, and I make bold to say that never did the household troops witness a day more honourable to their corps, nor one upon which they more brilliantly maintained the glory of their prince. Surmounting all difficulties presented by the roughness and inequalities of the ground, heedless of the enemy's menacing attitude, reckless of the murderous fire which swept their still unformed ranks, they bore steadily onward, and having crossed a deep, broad and rugged ravine, wherein many a gallant soldier fell to rise no more, they climbed the opposite bank. Here they were encountered by Ruffin's left wing and Rousseau's grenadiers, which latter gallantly descended from their position to give that reception which to such a warlike visit in martial country was due. But the Guards, having gained firm footing on the base of the hill, and no obstacle opposed save men in arms, British blood and British prowess soon prevailed. The chosen grenadiers recoiled from the shock. Ruffin, or rather Victor, who was present, tried to retrieve the disaster by bringing forward his right. But these were furiously attacked and driven backwards by the remnant of Brown's flank battalion, now amounting to nearly 200 men and one wounded officer. Both the enemy's flanks were thus turned round in rear of his centre.